let's begin slowly, with the big picture. Rome did not start with emperors. For centuries, it was a republic, ruled by elected officials, senators, and traditions that were supposed to prevent any one man from becoming a king. The Romans were proud of this system. They hated the very word rex, king. To them, kingship was something for the Greeks or for barbarians, not for Romans. But history has a way of bending. And by the 1st century BCE, the republic was showing cracks. The city had grown into a vast power, ruling the Mediterranean world. With that came wealth, ambition, and corruption. Senators fought bitterly, generals commanded private armies, and civil wars broke out. You might recognize some names from this time. Marius and Sulla, two generals who clashed violently. Then came Julius Caesar, perhaps the most famous Roman of all. His rise was dramatic, his power unmatched, and in the end, he was stabbed to death in the Senate in 44 BCE. The assassins thought they were saving the Republic, but instead, they opened the door to something new. After Caesar's death, his adopted son and heir stepped forward. His name was Gaius Octavius, but history remembers him as Augustus. At first, few people expected much from Octavian. He was young, not yet 20, thin, and often in poor health. But he was clever, patient, and cautious. He built alliances carefully, first with Mark Antony and Lepidus in what was called the Second Triumvirate. Together, they hunted down Caesar's assassins, defeating Brutus and Cassius at the Battle of Philippi. But power in Rome was never shared for long. Lepidus was sidelined, and soon Octavian and Mark Antony turned on each other. Antony had allied with Cleopatra of Egypt, and their romance made headlines across the ancient world. To the Romans, Antony seemed more Egyptian than Roman. Octavian used this to his advantage, declaring that Antony was betraying Rome. In 31 BCE, the two forces clashed at the Battle of Actium, a massive naval fight. Octavian's fleet won. Antony and Cleopatra fled, and not long after, both took their own lives. And with that, Octavian stood alone, master of Rome. Now, here's the tricky part. Octavian didn't call himself a king, and he didn't even call himself emperor, at least not at first. He presented himself as the first citizen, the princeps. He told the Senate and the people that the Republic had been restored, but everyone knew who held the real power. In 27 BCE, the Senate gave him a new title, Augustus, meaning the revered one. It was a title loaded with religious and moral weight. He also took the name Imperator, a commander's title. Over time, this word would give us the English word emperor. So Augustus was not a king in name, but in reality, he had all the power of one. He commanded the armies, controlled the treasury, appointed governors, and could veto decisions of the Senate. But he did it with subtlety, careful not to appear as a tyrant. Augustus was a master of image. Under Augustus, Rome enjoyed a long stretch of relative peace. Historians call it the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Roads were built, trade expanded, and monuments rose. The Ara Pacis, the altar of peace, still stands in Rome today as a symbol of this era. But don't let the calm fool you. Augustus could be ruthless when he needed to. Early in his career, he had proscribed enemies, hunting them down with brutal efficiency. He also exiled or quietly eliminated rivals within his own family. His image was carefully polished, but behind it was cold steel. He ruled for more than 40 years, the longest reign of any Roman ruler until much later. When he finally died in 18 CE, Rome was no longer a republic in spirit. It was an empire, with Augustus as its first true emperor. And so the line of emperors began. Each would inherit not just power, but also the delicate act of pretending not to be a king. Some would handle it well, others disastrously. But the pattern was set. Rome had crossed a line it would never walk back. When Augustus died in the year 14 CE, Rome faced a new question. Could anyone else really rule the way he had? He had built the empire around his own careful balance of power and image. And now, for the first time, Rome would see if the system could survive a change in leadership. The man chosen was Tiberius, Augustus's stepson. Tiberius was a seasoned general, skilled in war, but he was not loved. He was reserved, gloomy, and often uncomfortable in public life. Augustus himself had hesitated about naming him heir, but in the end there were few other options. Tiberius began well enough. He was cautious with money, careful with the army, and avoided reckless expansion. But as time went on, he withdrew more and more from public life. Eventually, he left Rome altogether, ruling from the island of Capri, far from the Senate and the people. In his absence, darker figures gained influence, such as the commander Sejanus, who carried out purges in the capital. By the time Tiberius died in 37 CE, his reputation was stained, and many in Rome breathed a sigh of relief. Next came Caligula. His real name was Gaius, but he was nicknamed Caligula, meaning little boot, from the tiny soldier's boots he wore as a child in the army camps of his father, Germanicus. At first, people adored him. He was young, energetic, and the grandson of beloved Germanicus. But within months, something changed. Some say Caligula suffered a severe illness, perhaps a seizure, and never fully recovered. What followed became the stuff of legend. He spent money recklessly, staged bizarre spectacles, and demanded to be treated as a living god. Stories claim he built a golden bridge across a bay, marched his army to the sea only to collect seashells as spoils of war, and that he made his horse a priest, or even a senator. Whether all of these tales are true or exaggerated, the image stuck. Caligula as a mad emperor. His behavior soon became dangerous. He executed senators and nobles without trial, confiscated wealth, and even turned against his own family. In 41 CE, after less than 4 years on the throne, members of his own guard assassinated him in a palace corridor. The Senate briefly considered restoring the Republic, but the guards had already declared a new emperor, Claudius, the uncle of Caligula. Claudius was an unlikely ruler. He had been mocked for years due to a limp and a stammer, kept away from politics, seen as weak. But when power fell to him, he proved surprisingly capable. He reorganized the bureaucracy, built new aqueducts, and expanded the empire by conquering Britain. He valued scholars and freedmen, elevating men of talent over noble birth. Still, his reign was not free of scandal. His marriages were turbulent, and his final wife, Agrippina the Younger, was especially ambitious. She arranged for her son, Nero, to be Claudius's heir. Some whispered that she poisoned Claudius to make it happen. And so came Nero, one of the most infamous names in Roman history. Nero began his rule in 54 CE as a teenager. For a time, he was guided by wise advisors, like the philosopher Seneca. At first, things seemed promising. Nero enjoyed music, theater, and poetry. He fancied himself an artist more than a soldier, but as he grew older, darker traits appeared. He had his own mother, Agrippina, killed after their relationship soured. He ordered the deaths of rivals and even his wives. His obsession with performance, singing and acting before audiences, shocked Roman elites who thought it beneath an emperor. Then came the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE. The fire raged for days, destroying large parts of the city. Rumors spread that Nero himself had ordered the fire, or that he had played the lyre while it burned. To deflect blame, Nero accused Christians, an unpopular minority, and launched brutal persecutions. By the late 60s, rebellion brewed across the empire. Governors and generals refused to obey Nero. Abandoned by allies and declared a public enemy by the Senate, Nero fled the city. In 68 CE, facing capture, he took his own life. According to legend, his final words were, "What an artist dies in me." With Nero's death, the Julio-Claudian dynasty came to an end. Rome had seen emperors both cautious and cruel, capable and chaotic. Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero each left their mark. And for the first time, the empire faced a crisis of succession without a clear heir. The stage was set for chaos. The year of the four emperors was about to begin. When Nero died in 68 CE, Rome was thrown into chaos. For the first time since Augustus, there was no clear heir. And in the vacuum, powerful men competed for the throne. What followed was a single, turbulent year, remembered as the year of the four emperors. The first was Galba, an old senator and governor of Spain. He was strict, stern, and thought of himself as a restorer of discipline. But his harshness won him no friends. He cut off payments to soldiers who had supported him, and within months he was despised. In January of 69 CE, he was murdered in the Forum by members of the Praetorian Guard. His replacement was Otho, charming, fashionable, and once a friend of Nero. Otho tried to win favor by presenting himself as a man of the people. But another general, Vitellius, was already marching toward Rome with his own legions. Otho met him in battle, and when his forces lost, Otho chose to end his life rather than drag the war further. Vitellius became the third emperor. His reign was marked by excess, feasts, banquets, and a life of indulgence while the empire still burned with civil war. But Vitellius didn't last either. A rival general, Vespasian, was marching from the east. Vespasian was a seasoned commander. He had been fighting a revolt in Judea when his troops proclaimed him emperor. Practical, tough, and no nonsense, he slowly gathered support. By December of 69, his forces entered Rome. Vitellius was killed, and Vespasian took the throne. The year of blood and chaos ended at last. Vespasian founded the Flavian dynasty, and he set about restoring stability. He was known for his dry sense of humor. When criticized for raising new taxes, including one on public toilets, he reportedly held up a coin and said, "Money does not smell." He also began construction of one of Rome's most famous monuments, the Colosseum, originally called the Flavian Amphitheater. Vespasian ruled for 10 years, bringing much-needed order. He balanced the treasury, rebuilt after Nero's extravagance, and kept the army loyal. When he died peacefully in 79 CE, his son Titus succeeded him. Titus had already earned fame as a general. He was the commander who captured Jerusalem in 70 CE, destroying the Second Temple. In Rome, the spoils of that victory were used to fund the Colosseum. But Titus himself was remembered more for compassion than cruelty. During his short reign, disasters struck. Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, burying Pompeii and Herculaneum. The next year, A fire devastated parts of Rome, yet Titus worked to aid survivors, and the people loved him for it. Sadly, he ruled only 2 years before dying suddenly, perhaps of illness. His brother Domitian followed, and with him, the Flavian dynasty took a darker turn. Domitian was efficient but autocratic. He demanded to be addressed as Lord and God. He strengthened the empire's borders and kept the army disciplined, but at home he ruled harshly. Senators hated him, and rumors of paranoia filled the palace. In 96 CE, conspirators within his own court assassinated him, ending the Flavian line. Looking back, the year of the 4 emperors had shown Rome the danger of succession without order. But the Flavians managed to rebuild. Vespasian's humor, Titus's kindness, Domitian's stern control. Together, they bridged the gap between the chaos of Nero and the golden age that was about to dawn. Because after Domitian's death, Rome turned to a new family, and what followed is often remembered as the high point of the empire's history. The age of the 5 good emperors. After the assassination of Domitian in 96 CE, the Senate moved quickly. They chose an elderly senator named Nerva as emperor. He was cautious, mild, and above all, acceptable to both senators and soldiers. His reign lasted only 2 years, but it set an important precedent. For the first time, the empire shifted power peacefully to a chosen successor, rather than a blood relative. Nerva adopted a capable general named Trajan as his heir, and with that decision, Rome entered what later historians would call the era of the 5 good emperors. Trajan ruled from 98 to 117 CE, and he was everything Rome could hope for in a leader. Brave in battle, generous to the people, and ambitious in vision. Under Trajan, the empire reached its greatest territorial extent. He conquered Dacia, modern-day Romania, and celebrated with a magnificent column in Rome that still stands today, covered in carvings of his victories. He launched campaigns into the east, fought Parthia, and built roads, aqueducts, and public buildings. He was remembered as Optimus Princeps, the best ruler. When Trajan died in 119, he was succeeded by Hadrian. Hadrian was different, less focused on expansion, more on consolidation. He traveled across the empire constantly, inspecting provinces, building fortifications. The most famous is Hadrian's Wall in Britain, a long stone barrier marking the northern edge of Roman control. Hadrian loved Greek culture, architecture, and philosophy. He rebuilt the Pantheon in Rome, with its vast dome that still amazes visitors today. His reign was peaceful, though marked by one terrible revolt in Judea, which he crushed with severity. Still, he was respected as a wise, cultured emperor. Next came Antoninus Pius, ruling from 138 to 161 CE. His reign is sometimes called the calmest of all. He rarely left Italy, preferring to govern from Rome. Under his care, the empire enjoyed stability, good finances, and quiet prosperity. He earned the name Pius for his devotion to duty and to the memory of Hadrian, who had adopted him. Some might say his reign was uneventful, but uneventful in Roman history was a blessing. Then came Marcus Aurelius, perhaps the most famous of the good emperors, known as the Philosopher King. He wrote Meditations, a book of Stoic philosophy still read today. Marcus was thoughtful, reflective, and tried to live with wisdom. But his reign was far from peaceful. He spent much of his time on campaign, defending the empire's northern frontiers against Germanic tribes. The empire was stretched thin, but Marcus remained steady. He ruled with a sense of duty, even in hardship. Alongside him for a time was his co-emperor Lucius Verus. Together they fought wars in the east, but Verus died young, leaving Marcus to rule alone. When Marcus Aurelius died in 180 CE, he broke the tradition of adopting a capable heir. Instead, he left power to his son, Commodus. Commodus was everything his father was not: arrogant, reckless, and obsessed with his own image. He fancied himself a gladiator, fighting in the arena dressed as Hercules. He renamed Rome the Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus. His reign was marked by extravagance and paranoia. He alienated senators, angered generals, and eventually even his own household turned on him. In 192 CE, Commodus was strangled to death in his bath by a wrestler hired in conspiracy. With Commodus, the Golden Age ended. The 5 good emperors had brought nearly a century of stability, wisdom, and prosperity. But one reckless heir was enough to undo. Rome was about to slide into new troubles after the death of Commodus in 192 CE. Rome plunged into yet another period of civil war. The Senate briefly chose Pertinax as emperor, an older man respected for his discipline. But he lasted only 3 months because the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own bodyguards, turned against him. They even went so far as to auction off the throne to the highest bidder. A wealthy senator named Didius Julianus won that auction, offering a fortune for the title of emperor. But the people of Rome were horrified. Soldiers across the empire were disgusted, and within weeks, rival generals began to march on the capital. Out of this chaos rose Septimius Severus, a commander from North Africa. He marched his legions into Rome, overthrew Julianus, and established himself as emperor in 193 CE, the beginning of the Severan dynasty. Septimius Severus was tough, cunning, and ruthless. He strengthened the army, increased soldiers' pay, and made the military the backbone of his power. He fought wars in Parthia, in Africa, and in Britain. It was under his rule that the empire became more openly a military monarchy. He told his sons on his deathbed, "Be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all others." His sons, Caracalla and Geta, inherited the throne together, but harmony was not in their nature. Within months, Caracalla had Geta murdered during a supposed meeting of reconciliation. Caracalla then ruled alone. Caracalla is remembered for 2 things. 1, his brutality. He massacred thousands of Geta's supporters. And 2, his citizenship decree. In 212 CE, he granted Roman citizenship to nearly all free men in the empire. This made taxes easier to collect, but it also marked a turning point in Rome's identity. Caracalla also built the enormous baths of Caracalla in Rome, vast public bathhouses that remain among the city's grandest ruins. But in 217 CE, while traveling, he was assassinated by his own soldiers. What followed was more instability. Brief emperors like Macrinus and Elagabalus ruled. Elagabalus, in particular, became notorious. A teenager who shocked Romans with his eccentric religious practices and disregard for tradition. He was eventually murdered by his own guards. Then came Alexander Severus, who tried to restore order. But by this point, Rome was facing bigger problems. Enemies pressed at the frontiers, Persians in the east, Germanic tribes in the north. The economy was faltering. And in 235 CE, Alexander Severus was killed by his troops, ending the Severan line. With his death began what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. For 50 years, Rome was torn apart. Emperors rose and fell with dizzying speed. sometimes ruling only months before being killed. The empire was divided by civil wars, invasions, and even breakaway states. The Goths, the Franks, and other tribes poured across the borders. The Sassanid Persians captured a Roman emperor alive, Valerian, and kept him in chains, a humiliation Rome had never imagined. Cities were sacked, trade collapsed, and the once mighty empire seemed on the brink of dissolution. And yet, somehow, Rome survived. A handful of capable emperors, like Aurelian, fought back. Aurelian reunited the empire, earning the title Restorer of the World. He built massive walls around the city of Rome itself, recognizing that even the capital was no longer safe. The crisis of the 3rd century revealed just how fragile the empire had become. It was no longer the stable, prosperous Rome of Augustus or Trajan. It was a state in constant emergency, relying on the loyalty of soldiers and the strength of a few individuals to hold it together. But from the chaos, reforms would eventually come. A man named Diocletian would rise, and with him, a new system. By the middle of the 3rd century, Rome was exhausted. The endless cycle of short-lived rulers had shown how fragile the empire had become. Most emperors were generals, lifted up by their troops in one camp, only to be killed by rivals soon after. Historians sometimes call them the barracks emperors, because so many of them came straight from the army camps. Names like Gallienus, Claudius Gothicus, and Aurelian appear in the record. Each fought hard to defend the empire. Gallienus managed to hold back invasions for 15 years. Claudius won a great victory over the Goths, earning the name Gothicus. And Aurelian, though he ruled only a few years, managed to reunite the fractured empire and strengthen its defenses. But none of them could bring long-lasting stability. Inflation ravaged the economy. Coins were debased with less silver, trade slowed, and the population felt the strain. The empire was too vast, too pressured on all sides. Then, in 284 CE, a soldier named Diocletian rose to power, and with him came one of the most dramatic reorganizations in Roman history. Diocletian was practical, disciplined, and deeply aware of Rome's problems. He knew that no single man could manage such a vast empire alone. So he created a new system, the Tetrarchy, rule of 4. Under this plan, the empire was divided into east and west. Each half had an Augustus, the senior emperor, and a Caesar, the junior emperor and heir. This way, no frontier would be left without leadership, and succession would be smoother. In theory, at least. Diocletian himself took the eastern half, ruling from Nicomedia, close to the troubled frontiers with Persia. He appointed Maximian as Augustus in the west. Later, 2 Caesars were added, Constantius Chlorus and Galerius. Together, these 4 men were supposed to secure the empire, and to a degree, it worked. Borders were defended more effectively. Rebellions were crushed, and the empire felt a measure of stability again. Diocletian also tried to fix the economy. He issued the Edict on Maximum Prices, an attempt to control inflation by setting price limits on goods. It didn't really succeed, but it showed how seriously he took the crisis. He also reformed taxes, reorganized provinces, and expanded the bureaucracy. Religiously, Diocletian is remembered for one of the last great persecutions of Christians. In 303 CE, he ordered churches destroyed, scriptures burned, and Christians forced to sacrifice to Roman gods. For several years, the persecution was intense, though it ultimately failed to eliminate Christianity. One of the most remarkable things about Diocletian was that he did something almost no emperor ever did. He stepped down. In 305 CE, he retired to his palace on the Dalmatian coast, in what is now split Croatia. The palace still stands, a reminder of a man who chose gardening and quiet over endless struggle. But retirement didn't solve Rome's deeper issues. The tetrarchy soon fractured. Ambitious men fought for control. Caesars tried to take the title of Augustus. Civil wars erupted again. Still, Diocletian's reforms left a lasting mark. He had shown that the empire could no longer be ruled as it had been under Augustus. It needed structure, division, and shared power. Though the system broke down, the idea of an Eastern and Western empire would remain, and in time, the East would outlast the West by 1,000 years. From the chaos of soldier emperors, Diocletian carved order, at least for a moment. But the real transformation was still to come. For from the struggles of the early 4th century, one name would rise higher than the rest. Constantine, the man who would blend empire and new faith, and change Rome forever. After Diocletian stepped down, the tetrarchy he created quickly unraveled. Rivalries flared, alliances collapsed, and once again Rome found itself in civil war. Out of this storm of competing emperors emerged one figure who would change the empire forever: Constantine. Constantine was the son of Constantius Chlorus, one of the Caesars under Diocletian's system. When Constantius died in 306 CE, his soldiers immediately proclaimed Constantine as emperor, but others claimed the throne too. For years, the empire was split among multiple rulers. Battles were fought across Europe, and it seemed as though the chaos of the 3rd century had returned. The turning point came in 312 CE, at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, just outside Rome. Constantine faced his rival Maxentius. Before the battle, Constantine reportedly had a vision. He saw a symbol in the sky, a cross of light, and words that meant, "In this sign, conquer." He ordered his soldiers to mark their shields with the Christian symbol, and that day, he won a decisive victory. Maxentius drowned in the Tiber River, and Constantine entered Rome as sole ruler of the West. From that moment, Christianity became tied to imperial power. The following year, Constantine and his co-emperor Licinius issued the Edict of Milan, granting freedom of worship throughout the empire. Christians, once persecuted, could now practice openly, and over time, the new faith gained imperial favor. Constantine continued to fight rivals until, by 324 CE, he stood as sole ruler of the entire empire. He had unified East and West again, something few emperors managed to do. Constantine is remembered for many things. He reorganized the army and administration. He minted new gold coins, the solidus, which would remain stable for centuries. But perhaps most famously, he founded a new capital. On the site of the old Greek city of Byzantium, he built Constantinople, a city of grand palaces, churches, and walls. It became the heart of the Eastern Empire, a city that would endure long after Rome itself had fallen. Constantine also involved himself deeply in church affairs. He convened the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, where bishops debated the nature of Christ and established what would become Orthodox Christian belief. For the first time, an emperor was not just ruler of Rome, but also a guiding figure in Christian history. Yet Constantine was not without contradictions. Though he supported Christianity, he was only baptized on his deathbed in 337 CE. He still honored old Roman traditions during his reign, using both pagan and Christian imagery. In many ways, he straddled two worlds, the old Rome of Jupiter and Mars, and the new Rome of the Cross. After Constantine's death, his three sons, Constantine II, Constans, and Constantius II, divided the empire, but their rivalry quickly turned violent. Constantine II was killed in battle against his brother. Constans was eventually assassinated, leaving Constantius II as sole ruler. Constantius II ruled for decades, but his time was marked by religious disputes. He leaned toward Arian Christianity, clashing with bishops who opposed him. He also fought wars against Persians and Germanic tribes. After him came Julian, remembered as the apostate, because he tried to restore traditional pagan worship. Julian was a philosopher, a writer, and a capable general. For a brief moment, it seemed the old gods might return. But Julian died in 363 CE during a campaign in Persia, and his attempt to reverse Christianity faded with him. The dynasty of Constantine ended with more instability, but his impact remained. He had given the empire a new capital, a new relationship with religion, and a legacy that reshaped the ancient world. Constantine is often called the Great, and whether one views him as a saint, a shrewd politician, or simply a survivor, his reign marked a turning point. Rome was no longer just the Rome of Augustus and Trajan. It was something different, a Christian empire, stretching into a new future. After Constantine's dynasty came to an end, the empire entered another long stretch of struggles. Successors rose and fell, often with short reigns, but one name stands out before the final curtain of the Western Empire: Theodosius. Theodosius the Great ruled in the late 4th century, and he was the last man to rule both East and West together. Under him, Christianity became not just tolerated, but the official religion of the empire. Pagan temples were closed, sacrifices banned, and the Christian church was given powerful support. By the time Theodosius died in 395 CE, Rome had become a Christian empire in truth, not just in name. After his death, the empire was permanently divided between his two sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west. From that point forward, the Eastern Roman Empire, what we call Byzantium, would live on for 1,000 more years, while the West slowly declined. The Western emperors of the 5th century were often weak, young, or controlled by powerful generals. Stilicho, Aetius, and Ricimer were the real powers behind the throne at different times. The empire faced wave after wave of invasions: Goths, Vandals, Huns. Peoples who once raided the borders now poured deep into Roman lands. In 410 CE, the unthinkable happened. Rome itself was sacked by Alaric and the Visigoths. The Eternal City, which had not fallen to a foreign enemy in 800 years, was plundered. Though the empire continued, the shock was immense. Later came Attila the Hun. His horsemen thundered across Europe, feared as the scourge of God. In 451, at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, Roman forces under Aetius managed to stop it. But the message was clear: Rome was no longer invincible. Meanwhile, emperors came and went at a dizzying pace. Some reigned only a few years, some only months. Few left a mark. The real authority often rested with barbarian generals serving in Roman armies, who became kingmakers and power brokers. One of the last emperors to hold any dignity was Majorian, who tried to reform the state and fight back the Vandals. But he was deposed and executed by his own general. After him, the Western throne became little more than a shadow. By the mid-5th century, the Vandals had seized North Africa, the Visigoths ruled Spain, the Franks pushed into Gaul, and Italy itself was exposed. The once vast Western Empire had shrunk to a fragile shell, and then, at last, came the final name, Romulus Augustulus. He was placed on the throne in 475 CE as a teenager. His name was symbolic. Romulus, the legendary founder of Rome. Augustus, the first great emperor. But in truth, he ruled nothing more than Italy, and even there he was only a puppet. In 476 CE, a Germanic general named Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus. The young boy was spared, sent into quiet exile, and with that, the Western Roman Empire came to an end. The East, ruled from Constantinople, would endure. Its emperors would still call themselves Roman, its people still speaking of Rome. But in the West, the line that began with Augustus passed through Tiberius, Caligula, Nero, Trajan, Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius, Constantine, ended with a powerless boy. It is a sad story, yet also remarkable, for in those 5 centuries of emperors, Rome transformed again and again, from republic to principate, from pagan empire to Christian state, from mighty conqueror to besieged survivor. Each emperor left a trace, whether through wisdom, cruelty, ambition, or failure. And though the empire in the West fell, its memory lived on, in laws, in languages, in the very idea of empire itself. When people today think of emperors, of grandeur and decline, it is Rome they imagine. So we close the story here, with the last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, a child on a throne that no longer meant what it once did. And we let the empire rest, knowing that even in its fall, Rome shaped the world forever.